The story in season 1 of Ted Lasso centers around Rebecca Welton. We start the season with the finalization of her divorce from Rupert Manning. As part of that settlement, Rebecca became owner of, in her words, the one thing Rupert ever loved, the football club AFC Richmond. After all the pain that Rupert has caused Rebecca, she makes it her mission to destroy this club, this one thing her ex-husband ever loved. This leads to her hiring American football coach, Ted Lasso, in hopes that his inexperience in coaching soccer will lead to the club's downfall. Along the way, Rebecca harms others as she brings them into her plot, one of these people being Leslie Higgins, the director of football operations for the club. She also makes some friends, including Keely Jones, who she hires to do PR for the club. She even comes along the way to have a little bit of sympathy for Ted. Just as Rebecca is pushing Higgins away, Keely inadvertently learns about Rebecca's plot, specifically a failed attempt to make Ted look bad. Keely gives Rebecca a chance, telling her that either you come clean to Ted or I'll do it for you. Shortly afterwards, Keely calls Rebecca out, calls her out for not having yet told Ted. Rebecca moans about this, asking, can you tell someone you harmed that you've harmed them for no reason at all? She also wonders if, now that this is all in the past, will admitting it do anything to change anything? And Keely gives Rebecca a very soft, very caring look, and tells her, change how I feel about it. Rebecca still struggles with getting the words out. What Keely has said to her does reach her ears. Eventually, she tells Ted what she did, and he forgives her. And then she goes to Higgins' house to get him to come back and help the team again. As she's talking with Higgins, she tells him, I lost my way for a minute, but I'm on the road back. Now I tell this story to explain our reading from Genesis today. Why the sacrifice of Isaac needed to happen. Now, as we saw at the start of this season of Pentecost, Abraham's story begins well. God asked him, while he was still just known as Abram, not yet Abraham, to leave his family behind, go with his wife Sarah, then just known as Sarai, to the great unknown. Abraham was 75 years old at this time, with no children, and yet God told him he would make Abraham into a great nation. That's what Abraham did. He believed and trusted in the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness, as Paul tells us in Romans for our reading on that very same Sunday. We heard about Abraham's journey. These seeds of Abraham's story have been laid for us for quite some time now. And yet, even at the start, we start to see some cracks form in Abraham's faith. He didn't quite leave his father's home behind, as God had asked him to do. Instead, he took his nephew Lot with him. And this almost led to disaster for Lot. As alluded to 2 weeks ago, with the mention of Sodom and Gomorrah, the place where Lot was living at the time. And at this time, it was getting ready to be destroyed for its sin of xenophobia. Yet, God still provided help and protection to Lot and his family. Then Sarah gets a bright idea. God's promise seems impossible to fulfill by ordinary means. Instead, she decides to use her servant Hagar, who we heard about just last week. And through Hagar, her thought is, maybe Abraham can have this child of promise. This, of course, leads to problems and to jealousy from Sarah. Yet, God assures Abraham the child that God has promised is still yet to come. And as we saw 2 weeks ago, that child of promise does come. 25 years later, after Abraham's journey away from his family, away from everything he's known before. Now, Sarah sees no need to keep Hagar and Ishmael around. And Abraham acquiesces to her request. He sends Hagar and Ishmael, his own son, out into the wilderness. And yet, even as he does so, God still provides. God promises to provide. He gives protection to Hagar and Ishmael, even though none of this was ever supposed to happen. Abraham has failed to fully trust in the Lord, fully trust in God's promise, time and time again. He's failed, and thanks to his own lack of trust, has failed to act justly as well. What he needs now is to prove himself again. He needs to live into the covenant that he made with God in those passages in between these passages we've been reading, all the way back in Genesis 15, back before the debacle with Hagar. What Abraham needs to do now is show that he can follow God's promise. The only way that Abraham can do that, show that he can follow God's promise, show that he can trust in the Lord, is by trusting that God will still make a great nation from his children, from Isaac specifically, even if Isaac would be taken away. Some look at this passage and see cruelty in making Abraham choose to sacrifice his own son. Those people fail to understand a crucial point. Abraham has had many adventures at this point. They have given him the chance to come to know God, at least to know God as much as any of us can. God did not let Lot die in Sodom and Gomorrah. Even though Abraham never specifically asked for God's help in this matter, never specifically asked for God to save Lot, although it is implied by his asking God to spare Sodom and Gomorrah if even only 10 righteous people can be found. And spoiler alert, they couldn't be. God was still willing to save Lot and his family. God could have overlooked the plight of Hagar and Ishmael. Ishmael wasn't even supposed to be born. He wasn't part of God's plan for Abraham and the nation of Israel that would come from Abraham's offspring. Ishmael is born from Sarah and Abraham trying to game the system, trying to game God. And yet God still looks out for Hagar and Ishmael and makes sure that Ishmael will be, that everyone's hands will be for him, even though this passage, that for, is mistranslated in every English Bible in the world. Ishmael is one that God raises up to have all these people for him, even though Ishmael had no part in God's original plan. God does not overlook anyone, not even those that Abraham brought wrongly into this drama. Brought wrongly into this drama by his own failing to trust the Lord. God certainly won't overlook Isaac, the child that God promised. What Abraham needs to realize is the truth of the words that he speaks to his son. God will provide. Abraham was lost, far gone. He failed to trust in God. He failed his son Ishmael even. It is rededicating himself to God, to trusting. For God, all things are possible, as our Lord Jesus Christ tells us. That Abraham is able to come back into the fold. Now, this is something we struggle with too. We struggle to trust in God. We struggle to believe that God will provide what we need. We struggle to have patience. We struggle to follow God's will. Like Abraham, Sometimes we need a nudge, if not a strong push, to turn back to God. Nothing good comes from making our own way. Nothing good comes from failing to listen to the Lord. So learn from Abraham. Trust in God. And turn back in those times that you failed to do so. In this way, we can follow the path laid out for us in our readings in the Gospel and in Romans. This way, we can turn back to righteousness. This way, we can turn back and be made